This meeting is being recorded. Good afternoon, everyone. I'm going to open today partly because I'm introducing Anthony, though normally Rudri and Kushank will take over the spot. They just asked me to kick in today. So good to see your faces and your myriad backgrounds from around the world, which is becoming the big novelty in the life of Zoom. Although I was just told to turn off my Eastern Arctic pictures. Maybe it made people feel too cold. Anyway, we have two students who are very near the end of their tenures here. As I understand it, Ilana, you're about to wrap up, and Anthony is literally on the verge of hitting send to external review for his thesis. So just to begin today, I just want to remind everybody that if you are on UBC campus, to please acknowledge that Point Grey campus is situated on the traditional and ancestral and unceded territory of the Musqueam people, but also like to acknowledge that you are sitting in many places today, and so to please recognize those places near and far and acknowledge the traditional owners and caretakers of those lands as well. I'll just jump into introducing Anthony. Some of the newer students might not know him because he hasn't been around as much as last year, but Anthony is in the literally closing moments of his PhD. He's going to talk about one chapter today, which will focus really on the emerging relationships between First Nations and the Canadian state around resource development. I've got some ideas that will be quite interesting to those who don't know BC. In particular, this is one of 4 chapters. The others, one focuses exclusively on the potential for redefining the meaning of property for First Nations in BC and the implications of that. Another one is on the emerging economies in nations around small-scale timber initiatives and housing in particular. So with no further ado, Anthony, I will let you take over and you should be able to share the screen.
Okay, thanks, Gary.
And I will wave my hand at you if you go over time.
Perfect. We're all good on the screen there?
Good, clear on my end.
Okay. So I'll start by acknowledging that I'm here in my home office on the traditional and unceded territory of the Coast Salish peoples and the traditional territory of the Snuneymuxw First Nation. And in making that acknowledgement, I recognize that in many contexts in this province that we now call British Columbia, it has quite important implications. And it's those implications that are largely the topic of my discussion today. Through a discussion of what I refer to as counter-institutionalizing. And really counter-institutionalizing is a generative way of understanding the creative, strategic, and pragmatic forms of First Nations engagement with the Crown and with settler colonial institutions broadly. And this offers somewhat of a complementary lens to otherwise predominantly critical frameworks. So much of my discussion today focuses around a specific type of counter-institutionalizing in relation to the duty to consult and accommodate. So a series of key legal decisions have found that resource extraction activities within the traditional territories of Indigenous groups infringe on Aboriginal and treaty rights, requiring a duty to consult and accommodate those affected. Within British Columbia, where outstanding First Nation land claims cover much of the provincial territory, and where resource extraction remains the primary model of economic development. The duty to consult is really what I refer to as a high stakes context. And there are many contributing factors. The one that most of you are probably aware of are Aboriginal rights and title, as defined by the courts and enshrined in the Constitution. But other factors include the fact that resource developments affecting First Nation territories range anywhere between $400 billion to $600 billion. this creates a desire on the part of governments and industry and even some First Nations themselves for economic and legal certainty. Another contributing factor is this idea of reconciliation. And the desire for the principle of the honor of the crown, requires that Aboriginal rights be determined, recognized, and respected. And this is a part of the process of working towards reconciliation. So really what that means is that reconciliation is not just a policy that governments take, it's actually a legal requirement, and it feeds the duty to consult and accommodate. And then finally, UNDRIP, and here in BC, Bill 41 and the implementation of UNDRIP legislation. So there's many new relationships and new forms of institutionalized engagement with First Nation groups that both strengthens and weakens their ability, the ability of First Nations governments to govern their territories, essentially. These processes are indicative of power imbalances, where sometimes First Nations are treated as governments, sometimes as stakeholders. But where there remains a paucity of information is on the Crown referrals process. So the study that I'm talking about today, it actually began as a technical study looking at software systems utilized by First Nations referrals departments. But I quickly identified a broader gap in understanding how the referrals process serves or not the territorial self-governance goals of First Nations. And so as a part of this study, I carried out surveys with 42 different First Nation groups and semi-structured interviews with 14 different First Nation staff. So what is a referral? A referral is the most common enactment of the legal duty to consult with a First Nation group. Their estimates of the number of decisions requiring consultation and referrals are approximately 200,000 per year in British Columbia. So an example of a typical day for one referrals department that I spoke with, they would see things like permits related to aquaculture, BC hydro pole replacement, private logging, amphibian research, a permit for filming, a permit for a walkway construction. So it really is the most direct and frequent form of institutionalized engagement between First Nation groups, the Crown, and resource development proponents. And for many First Nation groups in British Columbia, receiving dozens of detailed referrals in one or within a few days is typical. So numerous court decisions have contributed to what is now the duty to consult and accommodate. Some say that there's ambiguity in terms of how, when, and with whom consultation is practiced. There's others who say that the case law is quite clear. But where there remains uncertainty, perhaps, is in what adequate or meaningful consultation and accommodation actually means. And all that the courts have told us is that the level of consultation must be proportional to the strength of claim and to the potential impact on Aboriginal rights. So what this means is that on one end, there's a simple notification of activities. This is the lower end here. And then the requisition of full consent or accommodation of First Nation groups prior to government action on the other end. The problem with this is that the burden of identifying rights claims potentially affected by development activities lies predominantly with First Nation groups themselves. And these groups are often short-staffed without adequate resources. And so it creates an inherently unfair process, without a doubt. Further, the courts have made clear in various decisions, including as a part of the most recent Silcoteen title decision that you may have heard of, that Aboriginal rights and Aboriginal title can be infringed by economic development or environmental protection activities of broader societal interest. And so this is the rhetoric that we've heard from the Crown around oil and natural gas pipelines. It's what we've heard with the Site C Dam and with many other mega projects. And so ironically, with the recognition of title, which was a huge win, what's actually happened is that the focus of consultation and accommodation has begun to shift from arguments as to the strength of claim of title to those now focused on the justification of infringement of rights and title. And so these are just some quotes of some of the people that I spoke with that demonstrate really the futility and the frustration of the process for them. So given this dilemma, there's a tendency to focus on the weaknesses of Canada's regime for consultation and accommodation and all forms of institutionalized engagement with the Crown. So critical scholars assert that First Nation engagement and recognition by dominant colonial institutions is dangerous because it takes for granted the authority of the settler state and threatens to transform Indigenous peoples' ways of knowing and being as they resort to certain governmentalities, which is the idea that nations emulate the very institutions with whom they engage, thereby contributing to a type of self-subjugation. So despite increasing authority over territories through these recognition-based models, First Nations still very much must confront those which hold power over them, including resource development proponents and the state apparatus supporting them. But it's also important that we don't silence the many strategic actors who are First Nations working within the confines of these institutions to find in the cracks sometimes very significant leverage to control their economic futures. What I found is that resistance or outright refusal to participate is rare. Rather, through counter-institutionalizing strategies and tactics, First Nations are able to chip away at power imbalances in order to strengthen their decision-making position. So what do some of these look like? Historically, colonial governments have been able to limit or control information about activities on the land, but that's no longer the case, and it can become a powerful tool. So now through the Crown referrals process, there exists a forum for First Nation groups to receive information on all activity occurring within their traditional territories, to analyze and influence that activity, and in the best of cases, to prevent that activity. Some of these countermeasures are quite subtle, but also highly meaningful. For example, First Nation groups are pushing back against the stream of emails and paper letters that they were receiving about activities, instead now forcing the Crown and development proponents to submit all referrals through customized systems, setting their own timelines for responses. Through the referrals process, we've seen groups applying their own land use plans and their own evaluative frameworks to provide justifications and rationales for the rejection of certain developments. So the regional monitoring system of the coastal First Nations is one example. We've also seen First Nations building territorial alliances around the referrals process. Some examples are the Silcotin National Government, the Stolo Nations, the Coastal First Nations, and many others. Also, given the frequency and thoroughness of the consultation process, First Nations groups with strong systems to monitor activities across time and space and assess them against their own cultural and ecological databases can advance cumulative impact assessment and monitoring over their territories. So, at the time of writing this paper, for example, Blueberry River First Nation was able to leverage cumulative impact analyses to engage in a new land use planning and sustainable resource development decision-making relationship with the province. And this allowed them to avoid a lengthy battle for breach of Treaty 8 rights. Now, one of the biggest challenges for First Nations referrals departments and First Nations in general are financial resources. Own source and government funding we found were far from adequate to fund referrals departments and self-government processes. So these are the small circles and the medium circles that we see here. And really what this has done is it's forced First Nations into impact benefit agreements. So IBAs are paying for skilled referral staff, for the purchase of equipment and land management software, for hiring cultural and community monitors and technical specialists to support ground truthing research, particularly in relation to social environmental impact assessments. IBAs have really become of primary financial importance to territorial self-governance. And this is in many ways alarming and indicative of a certain developmental fait accompli for First Nations. And there are questions as to whether these agreements are of benefit to First Nations groups at all, whether they're representative of consensus within nations, or whether they're a de facto type of privatized negotiation of consent, which manifests the neoliberalization of the consultation and accommodation process. There are, however, a growing number of examples of First Nations who are inverting this economic equation, breaking their reliance on IBAs by building their own economies as the foundation for territorial self-governance. Now, what these economies look like, if they're not premised solely on resource extraction, remains unclear, and it remains one of the major tasks for First Nations moving forward. And this is really a part of the broader research question that I explore in my dissertation, as Terry mentioned. And so where do we go? There's a need for the Crown to shift towards a consent-based framework of engagement for all activity. This is what UNDRIP tells us. But even consent, as many understand it, appears to have its limits. So FPIC, as required, free, prior, and informed consent, as required under Article 32 of UNDRIP, it takes us further along. But most accounts of FPIC interpret consent as a process rather than an event. So although consent mandates a greater degree of consultation and respect for First Nation decision-making, most interpretations say it does not include a veto over projects. So really the ultimate form of counter-institutionalizing is going to come from Indigenous laws and Indigenous institutions. And the convergence of those laws with FPIC presents what I believe is a unique opportunity for reconciliation. However, we're not there yet. And First Nations in the interim need to continue to function and assert their authority to the best of their ability. And so counter-institutionalizing serves to level the playing field, at least a little bit, as it helps to define what the duty to consult means. And it will increasingly help define what FPIC means. And in doing so, it will take First Nations incrementally toward a position of empowerment within their territories. So, in conclusion, the consultation and accommodation process is inherently flawed. However, counter-institutionalizing measures allow First Nations to level the playing field, at least somewhat. Other types of counter-institutionalizing measures can be broad, they can be very profound actions, or they can be very subtle. Some include remapping and Indigenous land use planning, which can challenge industrial tenures, challenge conventional resource values, and even challenge the idea of what development itself means. Alternative revenue streams are needed. Things like, for example, ecosystem stewardship fees. The continued assertion of Indigenous laws. So the Silcotin Nation, for example, over the last several years has articulated and enacted and asserted up to 5 of their own Indigenous laws, including most recently the Silcotin wildlife laws. These are some of the most important counter-institutionalizing acts that nations can take. And then finally, it's very important that we recognize that counter-institutionalizing is something that comes from multiple active sites of resistance. So this is not just something that First Nations bands or First Nations governments that are recognized by the Crown can engage in. these types of actions can come from hereditary governance structures or from individuals themselves. And I will leave it there.
Thank you, Anthony. I will just unmute myself for now and watch for those little blue hands. And Kushank, maybe if you see some, please let me know too. Any questions for Anthony? And if you want to post a question to have one of us asked in the chat, that's also fine. Sticking, of course, with our students first rule. Okay, I hear silence. Is there anybody, am I missing hands anywhere?
Anthony, could we stop your
It might be good to stop the screen share so we can see each other.
Sure.
Great. Questions? Hunyi, I see you have your hand up. Please go ahead and talk. No?
Sounds like Johnny might have a question.
Okay, I don't see it. Johnny, please go ahead.
Hi, sorry, I'm just getting used to Zoom. I don't know how to raise my hand. I was curious, Anthony, how much of this strategy do you think is related to a given context? Because I've seen the work of Tyagi Alfred. He's done work with band offices and their relationships to grassroots organizations. And he found that some band offices were more, they had more engagement with grassroots activists and therefore were more willing to engage in resistance activities. And he found other communities, there was a stark division. So I was wondering how much your research might be influenced by the context in which you find yourself.
Yeah, that's a great question, Johnny. And I think you're absolutely right. It's highly context dependent. You know, particularly in British Columbia, where you have some 200 distinct First Nations, at least as recognized by the Crown. And so, yeah, I mean, some of the nations that I spoke with, they were working really hard to try to include the ideas and the perceptions of people on the ground, usually in terms of localized land-based knowledge around a project and around potential impacts of a project. I heard less about including grassroots community voices in response to referrals. So that's a good point, and I'm no doubt it exists, and I think that what would benefit this research would be a broader sample, no doubt.
Thanks, Johnny. Thanks, Anthony. I don't see any more student hands, and we might just have time for one more question. So please wave at me if I've missed that, but Layla's got a question. And she's asking, can you speak a bit more to consent as a process, your definition of consent as a process, and what limits or possibilities that definition holds?
Yeah, I think it's a challenging one, because I think in some senses, there's divergent views on this from both within First Nations themselves and from outside of First Nations on what consent means. And I think it'll continue to be a generative process to determining that. But, you know, at this point, I think some nations really want to understand consent as a type of assent, in the sense that it's, you know, an activity shouldn't go ahead without the nation fully agreeing to it, and they should be able to stop that activity. Whereas other nations see that if we take that type of interpretation of consent, then it's going to hold governments back from actually implementing FPIC or UNDRIP. But I think what's also important is that we understand consent as a process that doesn't end just with a decision over an activity or not, but it's a process that it's an ongoing process. So consent is something that continues throughout the life of a project or of an activity.
There's also the legal definitions that are unfolding as we speak, as that gets debated in the courts. Okay, we've got sort of 1 minute, which seems like that will only end up washing into Ilana's presentation. So I think maybe we should close there, and I will turn the screen over to Ilana.
Hi, thanks. I think Stephanie was going to give an introduction.
Yes, sorry, Stephanie.
That's
Stephanie,
all right.
too many thumbnail pictures up on my screen. Sorry,
Yeah,
please go ahead.
No. I'm really happy to introduce Ilana. Ilana is quite I guess there's no such thing as a typical master's student, but I think it would be quite fair to say that Ilana is not a typical master's student if there were one. She's been a practicing architect for over 20 years in both Montreal and New York City. Just before coming to UBC, she was a principal and director of sustainability at a major New York City architecture firm known for its pioneering work on sustainable high-rises. She's been really active in the green building space for many years, including serving on several industry task forces, for example, in New York, to address sustainability, climate change, mitigation, and adaptation in buildings. Among other things, she's also a certified passive house designer. So with all that background and a successful career, at some point she decided that she wanted to come back to graduate school and do some research on the topic of the relationship between climate mitigation and climate adaptation in the building sphere. So that's what she'll be talking about today. A really interesting project, and as Terry mentioned, coming to the near the end of it. So we have a lot to hear about today. So Ilana.
Thanks very much, Stephanie, for that great introduction. I'll share my screen. If you just hang on a second. Let's see. And okay, everyone should be seeing my full slides. If you can,
Good.
just
Yep.
let me know. Looks good. So good afternoon, everyone. Today I'll be presenting an overview of my research on adaptive mitigation, where I've developed a framework for assessing interactions between climate adaptation and mitigation strategies for urban multi-unit residential buildings. I'd like to first begin by acknowledging that I'm presenting on the unceded territory of the Coast Salish peoples, including the Musqueam, Squamish, Solo, and Tsleil-Waututh nations. I'd also like to thank our funder, the Pacific Institute for Climate Solutions, SSHRC, for their additional funding support, our solution-seeking partner, BC Housing, as well as, of course, my academic advisor, Professor Stephanie Chang, and my committee member, Professor Hadi Daladabadi. I thought today, my research is quite extensive and we have a limited amount of time. So I thought today it would be interesting for the IRES audience if I focus a little bit on my research process, because it was somewhat unique. So I won't have a lot of time to delve into the details of the findings, and I'll touch on the framework, but I do have a recorded presentation that goes into much more detail. So if anybody's interested in seeing that, feel free to reach out and I'd be happy to share it with you. So as I mentioned, my research focuses on the concept of adaptive mitigation. The IPCC and others have been advocating for a more integrated approach to addressing climate impacts to ensure that both mitigation and adaptation solutions are generated in a way to minimize unintended consequences. So adaptive mitigation really strives to reduce conflicts and increase synergies rather between mitigation and adaptation solutions, as well as, of course, greater sustainability solutions. So as an example of a conflicting strategy, you see the concrete seawall in the upper image, which while it protects from sea level rise and coastal flooding, it comes at a cost of high embodied carbon and coastal biodiversity loss and erosion, whereas the adaptation strategy below of a bioswale is much more synergistic. It's managing higher levels of stormwater runoff while at the same time cooling surfaces and ambient air, so reducing energy consumption for cooling and increasing biodiversity. I'm looking specifically at the concept of adaptive mitigation in the context of urban multi-unit residential buildings, otherwise known as MURBs. And the reason I've selected these, other than the fact that I'm an architect, is because buildings actually are responsible for a very significant proportion of global greenhouse gas emissions, both in their operational energy consumption, but also in the embodied emissions associated with the materials that are used in the construction of the buildings. And cities, urban environments are also particularly vulnerable to the impacts of climate change, not only because the proportion of the global population that lives in urban areas, the percentage of cities that are coastal, which is over 90% right now, and also MURBs are particularly interesting because, first of all, they have concentrated populations. And with respect to BC Housing, who is the research partner in this initiative, they're often housing some vulnerable residents, such as the elderly or low-income people. So really sort of the impact of sort of climate hazards on those populations, as we know, is even more exacerbated. So in the building sector, climate mitigation and sustainability initiatives have traditionally been very much siloed from adaptation and resilience due to many reasons. Timing is a big one, as well as differences of paradigms and approaches. And so there are almost no tools or frameworks out there to look at them in an integrated manner at the building scale. There are frameworks that have been developed academically for urban scales and municipal scales, but at the specific building scale, really understanding those interactions hasn't really been clear. So my research asks, well, how can they be integrated effectively? And also when teams are developing strategies and designs for urban multi-unit residential buildings, how can these proposed strategies be consistently evaluated to make sure that we're understanding synergies, trade-offs, and potential conflicts? So my goal is really in this process to develop an integrated adaptation and mitigation evaluation framework. It's targeted to BC Housing, but also to the broader context of policymakers, developers, owners, and designers of multi-unit residential buildings, both in BC, but also beyond. We're hoping that the framework will be used by other regions as well. So as I mentioned, I'd like to take some time to talk about the research process and the research model, because it was quite an interesting process. First of all, it's the result, the model is a partnership-based model. So Stephanie and I applied for a grant through the Pacific Institute for Climate Solutions Opportunity Projects Program. And this was a model where we partnered with BC Housing, who was the solution seeker. And in this case, the solution seeker could be someone from the private sector, a private company, a government agency, or an NGO. And the solution seeker here is looking for the researcher to bring theoretical knowledge, research skills, and sort of an academic approach to a practical solution that will be applied in either industry or in a governmental or policy context. So we applied for this grant with BC Housing under their Mobilizing Building Adaptation and Resilience program, which was a program that was started in 2018. And the goal of the program was to advance and sort of increase knowledge and awareness related to climate adaptation and resilience for the housing sector in BC, and also impact development of standards, policies, and codes related to adaptation and resilience in the housing sector in BC. So it's really been a partnership where I have been working with BC Housing in really sort of a back and forth process, and they've really provided in terms of expertise, access to stakeholders, and case studies, very valuable input. Because the goal was to develop an integrated evaluation framework that could be practically applied on projects, I used several qualitative methods, or multiple methods, to really kind of bring this framework together and to build it. And this was done in an iterative manner that was structured into 3 phases. So basically, phase 1, the goal was to collect information and sort of carry out an analysis that would help inform the overarching structure of the framework and the specific draft parameters, as well as the overall approach to how that framework might be carried out. So following a literature review, there was an extensive document analysis. I used sort of the lens of thematic analysis, where I looked at various existing mitigation and adaptation rating systems for buildings, as well as neighborhoods, guidelines, codes, and policy documents, and really sort of built that initial structure. This was then supported by semi-structured expert interviews that were conducted with a range of building industry and policy experts, both in BC and in New York City, so about 50-50, so half and half. So there were 22 experts that were interviewed, and they were selected to, they were identified as those who would be knowledgeable about either mitigation or adaptation, but also who would represent a diversity of expertise. So whether they be engineers, architects, building owners, planners, and so forth. So all of this informed the development of those draft parameters. BC was selected, of course, as a context given BC Housing, and New York, obviously because of my experience working in New York City, but they're also recognized as leading edge contexts for building related climate policy. So in terms of innovating at this level, there was sort of a good group of experts available. In phase 2, I tested those initial parameters and that initial structure through a case study workshop exercise that used BC Housing projects that were paired with various climate hazards. And participants here provided feedback on the framework process, as well as the specifics of the framework structure. And BC Housing at this stage also provided additional feedback in a separate meeting. This feedback was then used to build the framework in much greater detail and the associated tools. There are 3 tools that were developed. One is a high-level primer to introduce the framework to project teams and sort of the methodology. There's also a detailed reference guide, which gets into much more of the specifics of the evaluation process, as well as including more technical resources and guidance. And finally, an associated Excel tool that is used to document project information, proposed mitigation and adaptation strategies, and carry out assessments of those proposed strategies. So once that those tools were developed in draft format, they were presented to stakeholders who participated either in the interviews or in the case study workshop. And so they were presented online. And those documents were then sent to the stakeholders for a comment period where they could annotate the documents to provide very detailed feedback. And they were also given a brief survey. It was a qualitative, open-ended survey with 5 specific questions, just general questions about how the framework could be used and what was working and what wasn't working. I should mention here that the intention originally was to provide a second workshop, but because of COVID, we had to pivot and provide an alternate method. Unfortunately, I think because of COVID, we didn't get the same degree of feedback that was expected in a second full day workshop. So we held a more sort of targeted workshop to some key decision makers at BC Housing who provided, again, additional feedback, particularly on how the framework could actually translate from sort of a conceptual approach to actual application on building projects. So right now, I'm at the end of phase 3. I'm finalizing the final framework. And so I thought I would spend a few minutes talking a little bit about one of the methods, which perhaps is less utilized, since many of you are probably familiar with interviews and document analysis and so forth. But I wanted to talk a little bit about the case study workshop. As Stephanie can attest to, it's a method that's being used a lot by members of Stephanie's Hazards Lab. And it's really an effective way of providing sort of an inclusive environment for multiple types of stakeholders and to have a discussion, to work together and provide feedback and, in a context where you're dealing with a complex problem and you're looking for something that can be actually applied. So this was, a terrific opportunity to bring people together. And essentially, 40 experts were identified by BC Housing. Again, the idea was to identify a wide range of expertise in the building industry. And they participated in a full day workshop where they were basically, we used 3 project case studies that BC Housing provided, which were recently built projects, or actually one of them was under construction. They represented different regions in the province. And each group, so there were 6 groups that were formed, and the importance here was this notion of an integrated design approach, whereby you had people with different expertise working around the same table on the same problem. So a policymaker was with an engineer, was with a planner, an architect, and a building owner. And they were each given a different hazard to look at with respect to that project. And through the case study exercise, we're providing feedback both on the worksheets as they went through the exercise, but also there was a discussion at the end whereby everyone came together. We discussed a series of questions, and this information was extremely valuable to help me build the tools that were developed for phase 3. So here's an extract of one of the case study exercises. I know the text is a little small to read, but essentially, if anybody is interested in learning how to put together a workshop this was a really great learning experience in terms of thinking through the right way to bring together stakeholders. So here, teams were given a package of information, both of images, drawings, site images, neighborhood information, and also information about the project stakeholders, information about the climate scenario they would be using, as well as the hazard they would be looking at, and a hypothetical neighborhood resilience assessment, which they could understand sort of the interaction between their project and the surrounding context with respect to the climate hazard they were looking at. And then they simulated sort of this process of establishing what the project risks were, what their climate mitigation and adaptation goals might be, some proposed strategies, and how to evaluate those strategies for either synergies or trade-offs, for example. So the resultant framework is called the Integrated Building Adaptation and Mitigation Assessment, otherwise known as IBAMA. It's really sort of structured into 4 stages that involve 12 specific actions. It's meant as an early project planning tool, so really meant to be sort of used in the pre-design and early design phases, with follow through, as the project evolves into design and construction. The first phase involves collecting information about the project, both, sort of the hard stuff, the budgets and the project technical requirements, but also the demographics, who are the occupants and what their vulnerabilities might be. Information about the climate scenarios, the potential hazards that impact the project, and understanding the level of resilience of the neighborhood. From this, the project teams identify assets and risks in the neighborhood that could impact the project. So for example, how good is the stormwater system if you're looking at a increased precipitation scenario? Is it very robust? If not, what do you need to do on your project, for example? Identifying project risks, setting goals with respect to both adaptation and mitigation, sort of in concert or in parallel, and having those strategies emerge from those very specific goals, because those goals specifically with adaptation can vary significantly. And then finally, evaluating those strategies under a unified lens. And of course, providing a mechanism whereby if they don't fare well, they can be reevaluated and adjusted. So this is just a snapshot of the final section of evaluation and some of the criteria that the project team would be using. This is a poor air quality scenario, which we've all recently, or many of us have recently experienced here in BC. Some proposed strategies, for how to deal with that situation, and the criteria that they would be evaluated for. So not only mitigation and adaptation, as you see on the screen, but also technical requirements, costs, other things that would be typically associated with, any building project, for example. And the tools that I've developed enable project teams to see, how these strategies score across these requirements, where the trade-offs might be, as you see in yellow, where the synergies might be, as you see in green, and where there might be conflicts, and graphic tools to show where strategies may fare well in certain areas, but poorly in other areas. So in conclusion, I just wanted to note some of the benefits of this approach and also some of the limitations of the, of working in this way. First of all, multiple methods have, benefits in terms of triangulation, in terms of corroborating information, but in a master's thesis, of course, it's challenging to get into great depth when you use multiple methods. I could have, of course, interviewed 50 people instead of 22, for example, or looked at documents beyond BC and New York City. But the iterative approach was very useful, particularly in in ensuring that, you know, this is a tool that can actually be put into practice and getting that feedback. And finally, I'd like to say that the partnership model was also really interesting with BC Housing, in that, you know, they brought great resources in terms of case studies, in terms of, you know, expertise and access to stakeholders, and also the ability to employ this framework. But the sort of academic model and aspirations don't always align with what's actually happening in practice, and the level of expertise or the professional practice methods, and finding that balance of designing a framework that could actually be employed. You know, there's an interesting challenge there. So, you know, if anybody has any other questions, I'm happy to respond by email. The framework version 1 will be out in November, and we're speaking with BC Housing now to look at how we can, you know, try to test this on an actual pilot project. So with that, I'll stop my screen share. There we go.
Thanks, Ilana. That was great. Stephanie, do you want to field questions for
Oh, I thought Ilana could do that.
Or Ilana
It's
can
probably
do
more
it.
efficient.
Sure. Oh, I see lots.
I'll keep an eye on this too.
Oh my goodness. Okay. Let's say Nigel. Let's start with Nigel. He's the first one I see on the screen. So.
Sorry, just clapping.
So there are many sides.
Oh, clapping? Okay.
Yeah.
Sorry about that.
I'm looking in the participants list for little blue hands.
Mauricio, I see, has raised his hand.
Yeah, hi, congratulations on your presentation. So I might have misunderstood some aspects, so I just wanted to clarify.
Sure.
You would be evaluating through your framework design characteristics and actions. Do you see this being more potentially being applied for new buildings and projects, or is there also potential for retrofitting? And if so, like, what would be the limits?
Sure. So initially, I started off with the idea that this would be for new buildings, just because retrofits have their complexity. You know, there's so many different types of existing buildings. And typically with codes, building codes, you know, they're designed for new buildings, and then they can be adapted. You know, certain things sort of spill over into retrofits, which is what's happened in Vancouver. But in developing the process, as you saw, sort of, it's a methodology. And so I think it definitely could be applied, sort of, even though it wasn't my intention, it could be applied to retrofits. There would be some additional parameters. I didn't get into all there's, you know, many parameters in the framework. So I didn't get into all of those, but there would be perhaps some additional parameters to be modified, you know, things like considering, you know, to what, you know, how old the existing building is, to what code was it built to, you know, logistics about moving people in and out of the building while you're doing these things. So definitely overall it could be used, but there might be some adjustments. And I would say the same thing for other building types. You know, if you were looking at an office building or a school, for example, you might be looking at some other parameters that are different than if you're looking at people who are actually living in a facility. Let's see, who else?
I see that Rudri had her hand up, and she's also got a question in the post. Rudri, you want to just go ahead and ask?
Sure. Hi. Thanks, Ilana. Great presentation. So you said you interviewed experts from both BC and New York. So I was curious what you found were the most striking differences between expert responses, and since your context was BC at the end, how you translated those differences?
Sure. Well, I think there's differences in hazards naturally. So, you know, New York has been very, well, there's a couple of things. First of all, New York has experienced a major event, which is Hurricane Sandy. So there's, you know, sort of in terms of, there's been a lot of planning around adaptation and resilience that's happened in BC, and it's growing, you know, over time. But in terms of responding to an actual event, you know, obviously New York has, you know, they have a very robust, you know, infrastructure in place to do that. So that's been, I think, the most significant difference. the hazards are different as well. So New York sort of dealing with major coastal flooding issues, where BC also that's an issue as well, but it's slightly different. Sort of the nature of the hurricane versus the flooding here. And I would also say that some of the issues that we face here have to do with the way in BC that buildings are built. So in BC, most buildings don't have air conditioning. For example, a lot of the older buildings don't have mechanical ventilation. And in New York, even though we have more, there's extreme heat is an issue in both contexts. It's hotter in New York, so most buildings have air conditioning. And in BC, we have the wildfire issue. So the hazards really have, I think those have been striking differences as well. And I would also say that a lot of the experts I interviewed in New York were they're practitioners that are working in, because New York, a lot of New York engineers and architects have projects globally. So there's a lot of international experience that's coming from those New York practitioners, so they can reference, contexts in Asia, for example, when I was interviewing them.
Thanks, Ilana.
Anybody else?
Other questions, folks? I can't see, I'll see if there's any hands raised. Physically, I don't see any. I'm just scrolling through attendees. Any last questions for Ilana?
Again, if anybody is wanting to put together a workshop, I'm happy to talk to them, because it was a very interesting process, so, both online and in person.
Do you think that's a pretty transferable method in the end?
The workshop?
Yeah, no, the sort of the stages you went through to essentially iterate evaluative criteria for adaptation / mitigation, or is it just too idiosyncratic to the building sector?
Well, I think if you are looking to apply something in practice, I think sort of that process of dealing with stakeholders, getting their feedback, I think it could be definitely, if you're working in fisheries, if you're working in another field, I feel like, sort of getting that continuous feedback is really helpful.
Oh, for sure.
In applying something. So I don't know other fields, of course, but I would say, yes, just that back and forth process was extremely helpful, but also challenging to kind of, aspire to something as opposed to, balance what the sort of current level of practice is.
Yeah. Great.
If I could just jump in on that one, I think one of the distinctive aspects here is not has to do with transferability. Isn't necessarily so much the sector, but the willingness of there being a leading partner organization in the domain that's really keen on this topic, that's already been doing some work in the project, in the area, that's receptive to and eager for new tools, ready to implement them. So I think that having an organization in that position, in that sector, maybe I would say pretty key to whether or not the method is
huge factor in success. Yeah.
Yeah.
That makes sense. Okay, I think there's a couple of comments in the chat for you, Ilana, if you can see them. Just
Yep, feel free to send me an email. It's on my profile in IRES, on the IRES student page. So if anybody has more questions, be happy to correspond or chat with you.
yes, that'd be great. And thank you, everyone. I guess we can sign off until next week. And yeah, please get into the habit. Maybe it is better to use the chat for questions. Those are always visible. I hope I haven't missed anybody. And thanks, Ilana and Anthony. Great presentations. Bye now. I'll sign off.